Syria, Saudi Arabia, and Iran begin selling oil to China for bonds that are immediately convertible to gold. BRICS membership is now nearing 90% of the world population, and all these countries are dramatically expanding their gold reserves. China's Belt and Road Initiative is moving towards connecting nearly 3/4 of the world population into its centralized system with the digital Chinese yuan. And the US government is left holding a bill they can't pay and a war machine they can't afford. The US Mint is making it difficult for citizens to buy gold and silver, as if they want everyone at their mercy when it all goes to zero. Their only solution seems to be total control. This is at least one of the reasons why Elon's Twitter files are spread out like a Netflix series, to keep Americans busy while their entire life savings are swiftly turned to zero.
The Federal Reserve increased interest rates. Of course, they had been promising to increase interest rates, and they delivered on that promise. As much as the Fed claims it doesn't care what the markets do, it cares very much about what the markets do.
In today's world, the future can seem unnerving. Have you tried to buy groceries lately and noticed your bill seems pretty high? Inflation isn't just coming.
And so it tries to craft what it does with the markets in mind. We have so much more debt now than we had in the past. It's a whole different world. Just because the economy could survive 5% interest rates when we had a relatively small amount of debt to service doesn't mean the economy can also survive 5% interest rates when we have a mountain of debt to service, both in the private and public sectors. But nonetheless, is the biggest interest rate hike in 28 years. So it's very rare that the Fed moves by 75 basis points. So after all these rate hikes, in a world where you have 8.6% inflation, interest rates are still highly inflationary. And so the Fed remains behind the curve. Despite this rate hike, inflation is going to get worse. It's not going to get better, although Powell is prepared to pretend that it will. But I think both consumers and investors are wrong with these expectations. What was neutral in the past when inflation was under 2% is not neutral in the present when it's over 8%, because neutrality is supposed to be an interest rate that is neither stimulative to the economy nor sedative to the economy. It's supposed to have no effect. Well, clearly, an interest rate in a 2% inflation environment is going to have a very different effect if you have the same interest rate in an 8% inflation environment. And so clearly, if 2% was neutral in the past, at a minimum, 8% would be neutral now, and we're not going to get anywhere near 8%, and so the Fed is not going to get anywhere near neutral. And if it's not even going to get neutral, let alone restrictive, what hope does it have of actually solving the inflation problem and returning the annual rate back down to 2%? If the Fed really was determined to make sure it eradicated inflation for good, it wouldn't be talking about any victory claims simply because inflation was headed down. They want to make sure that it is down and that it stays down. So what Powell should have said is, we will not back off until not only inflation has returned to 2%, but that it stayed at 2% long enough so that we're convinced that it's going to stay down there and not go right back up. Because what happens if inflation's 8.5% and then it goes down to 5 or 4%, and the Fed is, okay, great, it's going to go to 2, and it never hits 2, and the next thing you know, it goes up to 10. The Fed can't take any chances. But I think the Fed is already setting the markets up for a premature victory claim, because I think the Fed knows it can't actually beat inflation, but it's hoping that maybe it can fool the markets into thinking that it beat it, and it can pretend that it beat it by declaring victory, even though a victory hadn't been won. Just got this inflation. It's not like it's been here for a long time, and so easy come, easy go. It just came around, and now we're going to get rid of it, and the public doesn't expect it to continue because it's so new, and all of that is simply not true. And again, we have had inflation for a long time. It's just that the public wasn't complaining about it for a long time because it wasn't this extreme, but we still had it. And of course, when inflation was predominantly in financial assets, nobody complained. And of course, in the early days of this inflation, if you go back to 2008, 9, 10, the Fed created a lot of inflation, but what that did was prevent prices from falling, not really pushing prices up. If it wasn't for QE1 and QE2, the Great Recession would have been much greater, and we actually would have seen a healthy decline in the cost of living and consumer prices. Why didn't that happen? Well, because the Federal Reserve printed all this money. So yes, there's an inflation problem in Europe. Yes, there's an inflation problem in Japan. There's inflation problems all around the world because central banks all around the world made the same mistakes as the Federal Reserve. In fact, the Federal Reserve may have been the leader, and all the other central banks were following in their misguided